Hey everyone, in this video, we're going to go over the basics of IAM in AWS. So IAM is Identity and Access Management, and it's the way we can manage permissions in AWS. So I already opened up IAM in AWS here. You can search for it here, find your services. And once you're here, I'm already on users. And I'm going to go over the basics of IAM and how this all works. So to begin, there's three different things you need to know when using IAM. We have users, we have groups, which you'll see here, and we have roles. So users you can think of as the end user. It's a person almost. A group can just be a group of users. And the role is a list of permissions we can give to either a user, a person, or to an actual service. So for example, if I were to search Lambda, you can see the different Lambda roles that we have here. So when I create new Lambdas, I create a role. This role gives the Lambda certain permissions, and the permissions are listed under the policy. Lambda policies are a JSON document that looks like this. So you'll have a version, a statement, and inside the statement, we have an effect, either allowing or denying different access. We have actions, which are the different permissions we're allowing this role to do. In this case, we're allowing it to write to CloudWatch logs. And then we have a resource, which defines which specific resources have this, which specific resources this role has access to, and a star means everything. So that is kind of the basics of how this all works. But let's go ahead and go through and actually create these different things to kind of make this all hopefully make a little more sense. So we'll start with users. Let's go ahead and create a new user. So first we'll give it a name. I'll say test user. And by default, they don't have access to the console. They only have programmatic access through the CLI. But if you want to give them access to the console, you can click this access to AWS Management Console. And this gives us a way to either create them in the Identity Center or create an IAM user. In this case, we can give it console access, I guess. We click next. I'm going to go ahead and make this an IAM user. We can leave it just as an auto-generated password. We'll click next. We can add it to a group. For now, I'm going to go ahead and skip this. Now let's go to next. And then we have permission summary. And I'll click create user. Okay, so now we have a sign-in URL, username, and we have this default password right here. Let's go back to our users list. Now it's important to note that once we go to this page, you can't see the default password anymore. But you can generate a new password right here. I can show it here to allow them to log in if you didn't save it before. You can also download CSV as well. Okay, so now we have a user created. Let's go ahead now and look at our groups. So we have this default developers group, and right now permissions on this group, it gives us EC2, RDS, S3, and VPC access. What we can do is we can add our user we just created to this group. So if I hit add users, I then click on test user and add users. Now by adding to this group, we now give the permissions of this group to this user. So if we go back to users and look at my user now, you now will notice that we have a bunch of new permissions added. Before all we have was IAM password permission, but now we have VPC, S3, RDS, and EC2 full access. And the reason for that is because they're in this group. If I were to come in here and I were to remove them from the group and click remove, and I come back to users, go to my test user, now they only have that one policy again. Okay, so now we have a user in a group with a bunch of different permissions. Let's look at roles now. So we can create a new role, and we can give this trusted entity type to be an AWS service. And let's say we're going to give it Lambda permissions. And in this case, you can see here our use case is allows Lambda functions to call AWS services on your behalf. If I were to search for Lambda, you can see some default permissions we have here. And we'll give it like a basic execution role, which if you look at the policy, allows it to write to CloudWatch logs. We can add permissions boundaries if you wanted to control the maximum permissions, but in this case, we're not going to worry about that. Let's go ahead and click on next. I can say Lambda basic execution role custom. You can give it a description you want. Here is the policy, and here are the permissions. We'll go ahead and create the role. Now that we have that role created, if I were to go ahead, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this tab, to show you the difference from roles and users. I'm going to then go to Lambda, my Lambda function. I can then create a new function. We're not really going to make a function here, so let's make it whatever. But down here in permissions, I can change the default execution role, use an existing role, and I can search for Lambda basic execution role custom. I can now create this function. I then go to configuration, permissions, this Lambda basic execution role custom. I can click on it, and we can see what permissions this Lambda has. Permissions policy, it has access to the CloudWatch logs. So that's the difference between users and roles. I can't put a user on a Lambda or any other AWS service, but I can put a role to give it permissions. So if you need to give permissions to a specific service, like a Lambda function or an S3 bucket or whatever, you need to make sure you put a role on it and not a user. Okay, so now we know the difference between roles, users, and groups. Let's look at policies a little bit more. So when we create a policy, we can go here and specify the permissions here. We can, it gives it kind of like a visual sort of way to add permissions. It makes it a little easier. So we can add a Lambda permissions again. Then we can go ahead and we give a list of all the different permissions we could add. And with AWS, there is this idea of least privilege access. So you want to make sure you give it the least amount of permissions it needs to do its job. So it's very important that we don't give more permissions than what we need, because that violates best practice. So let's say we want to go ahead and read some different things. We could say, okay, we want to get the function configuration, the layer version. Maybe we need to write and create a new Lambda function, or we need to maybe we need to invoke another function. That's a pretty common permission. We select all the ones we need, and then we could select specific functions and we click add ARN. We can add it here, or we could leave it to all, but this isn't really great because you give it too many permissions probably, but in this case, for this example, we'll leave it as all. We'll click next. We can then give it a name, and we can create the policy. And so now we created policies with those specific permissions, and if we search for Lambda, we should see it. There it is, Lambda test policy. And you'll see that we have access to invoke the function, get layer version, and function configuration. Now, to put this policy on a user or a role or anything else, we can go to it. We can then do add permissions. We can then search for our policy we just created, test, and click on this Lambda test policy. Click next, and click add permissions. And that adds those permissions onto our user. We can also, if we didn't want to go through all those steps on this page here, we can also go to this dropdown, add permissions, and create an inline policy. And this will be exactly what we used before, but now we're adding it directly to this user. So I can go back to Lambda or any other service. I can then just add a permission, like in this case, we can add update function code, maybe if you wanted to allow it to update the code. We're then allowed to do any of them. For this example, click next. We can give it a name. Create policy. And now it's added directly onto our user for us. So that's how we add permissions to users, roles, and groups. Users being people, groups being groups of users, and roles being permissions we can apply to both users as well as AWS services. There's one more thing I want to go over before ending this video. This is the basics of how to create different things, but you notice we added permissions. We never really tested anything working, and there's no way to know if these actually do what we want them to do. So I'm going to create a very basic user just to keep things simple so you can see what we're doing. I'm going to say RDS user. I'm going to create next on this user, and I'm going to do next. Create the user. They now will have no permissions other than the default, or in this case, they have no permissions because we didn't give them console access. So I'm going to go ahead and create an inline policy. I'll add a permission. I don't need to create a policy because they should already exist. I'm going to then attach policies directly. I'm going to search for RDS, and you'll see RDS full access. I'm going to give them that permission. So now they should be able to do anything with RDS, but nothing else. but there's no way for us to test that they can actually do that. But luckily, AWS has a policy simulator. So if you go to https://policysim.aws.amazon.com, you'll see, you'll get this screen. And this allows us to test our policies. So we can click on our new RDS user that we just created. And then you can see our policies right here. Let's go ahead and then search for something. So we'll do like API Gateway. API Gateway is not part of RDS. It is something that this user has no access to. So if we click on a gateway and we try to invoke an API Gateway and we run the simulation, you'll see we get a implicitly denied. There's no matching statement in this policy for it. However, we go to RDS, and they're in alphabetical order. So I scroll down RDS. We can then click on anything, really. I guess we can do delete DB instance, run simulation. It's allowed. We click on a different thing, click on a bunch of different permissions, all in RDS, run simulation, and they all go allowed because we have full access to RDS, so all of our RDS services will be allowed. But as soon as you click on something else, anything else that's not RDS, we can now see that it is failing. So this is a good way to test your policies to make sure they're actually doing what you want them to do. You can test them by creating a new policy here and test them before you actually create anything. You can do it on an already created user like we did here. It's a good way to validate that everything's working as expected. But that's really it. That is the basics of IAM. Hopefully that helps you understand how to use this and how to manage your permissions. It's something you'll get used to the more you use it, but hopefully that gives you the basics and helps you get started. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.